She's standing in the kitchen holding her car keys, not because she's about to leave, but because she found them in the freezer, again. She's a project manager who runs a team of 12 people. She reads contracts for fun. She remembers every birthday in her family without checking her phone. And yet, for the last 6 months, she keeps walking into rooms and forgetting why she's there. She loses words mid-sentence. Not small words, big ones. Words she's used her whole life. She starts to wonder, is something wrong with me? Is this the beginning of something I can't come back from? That woman is not alone, and what's happening to her is not what she thinks. Welcome to PsyCraft Daily, where we break down the psychology and neuroscience behind the human experience in ways that actually make sense. Today, we're going deep into one of the most misunderstood chapters in a woman's life, and by the end of this, you're going to see it completely differently. Here's the thing, most people get wrong right out of the gate. When a woman in her 40s starts noticing memory slips, foggy thinking, or emotional intensity she's never felt before, the first instinct, from doctors, from family, sometimes from the women themselves, is to frame it as loss. Something is going away, something is declining, but that's not the full picture, not even close. Neuroscientist Lisa Mosconi at Weill Cornell has spent over a decade scanning women's brains across different life stages. And what her imaging data shows is not a brain deteriorating. It shows a brain in active transition. The architecture is literally changing. Blood flow patterns shift. The energy systems the brain runs on, specifically how it processes glucose, go through a period of adjustment. This is real. It is physical. It is measurable. And for a window of time, it can feel absolutely destabilizing. Think about that for a second. You wouldn't look at a caterpillar mid-transformation and say, that butterfly is falling apart. But that's essentially what we've been doing with women's brains in perimenopause and the years surrounding it. Now, here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. The cognitive shifts women experience, the brain fog, the word-finding hiccups, the forgetfulness, they tend to cluster in a specific phase, not permanently, not progressively. They cluster in the transitional window, when estrogen is fluctuating wildly, not after it stabilizes. That's a critical distinction, and almost nobody talks about it. Estrogen isn't just a reproductive hormone. It's been acting as a kind of neural maintenance crew your entire adult life, regulating inflammation, supporting the growth of new neural connections, protecting the myelin sheath that wraps your nerve fibers like insulation on a wire. When estrogen starts its erratic final dance before it settles, that maintenance schedule gets disrupted. The brain is scrambling to find new energy pathways, and during that scramble, you forget where you put your phone. You lose the word peripheral at a dinner party. You cry at a commercial about paper towels. So, what do you do with that information? First, stop catastrophizing the fog. If you're in your early to mid-40s and noticing these shifts, the most important psychological move you can make is to stop interpreting short-term disruption as permanent damage. The research does not support that conclusion. Second, start talking to a doctor who understands hormonal neuroscience, not just reproductive medicine, but the brain-hormone connection specifically. There is a meaningful difference between those two conversations. Now, let's talk about the piece that tends to blindside women the most. Because memory stuff, you can kinda laugh at that. You can make a joke about losing your keys. But this one hits differently. Many women in their 40s describe suddenly feeling emotions at a volume they've never experienced. Things that used to roll off them now stick. Frustrations that used to feel manageable now feel enormous. There are nights of lying awake running mental loops on conversations that happened 3 weeks ago. There's a new sensitivity to conflict, to injustice, to being unseen or unheard. And sometimes, this is the part women whisper about, there's rage. A clean, clarifying rage that has no polite word attached to it. And immediately the cultural messaging kicks in. She must be hormonal. She's being dramatic. This is the beginning of a difficult phase. She should probably calm down. But here's what most people miss. And this is the psychology piece I want you to really sit with. The emotional amplification many women experience in this phase is not random neurological noise. Research in effective neuroscience suggests that as estrogen fluctuates, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection and emotional processing center, becomes temporarily more reactive. The regulatory circuits that sit in the prefrontal cortex, which normally help filter and contextualize emotional responses, get less input from estrogen's stabilizing effect. The result? Emotions that feel disproportionate to the trigger. But here's the key word: feel disproportionate. They are often pointing at something real. There's a therapist named Dr. Christiane Northrup who has written about this at length, and one of her core observations is that midlife emotional intensity in women frequently operates like a psychological purge. Things that were tolerated in the name of keeping the peace, unfair dynamics in relationships, work situations that depleted without replenishing, long-held beliefs about what a good woman does or doesn't express, suddenly become intolerable in a way they never were before. The emotional volume goes up right when the patience for certain kinds of self-suppression goes down. That's not a malfunction. That might be a reckoning. Think about Nadia, 43, 2, kids, 15-year marriage, good career. By every external measure, her life is fine. But she starts waking up at 3 a.m. with her heart pounding and this overwhelming feeling that she is profoundly, invisibly unhappy. She doesn't understand it. She goes to her doctor. She gets blood work. She's told her hormones are shifting. She's offered a mild antidepressant. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she thinks, maybe I'm just not cut out for this much longer. What nobody told Nadia is that her brain, in its hormonal recalibration, had lowered her tolerance for chronic unmet needs and brought to the surface a decade of quietly swallowed discontent. The wake-ups weren't psychiatric, they were informational. So, what do you do when the emotional volume gets cranked up like this? Don't reach straight for the suppressor. Sit with the question, what is this feeling pointing at? Emotion amplification in perimenopause often functions as a signal, not a malfunction. Journaling, specifically. Processing through writing has solid research behind it for making sense of emotionally noisy periods. And if the intensity is genuinely impacting your functioning, sleep, relationships, work, that's not weakness. That's data that you need support, whether hormonal, psychological, or both. Let's get specific about memory, because this is the thing that scares women the most. And the fear itself compounds the problem in ways that matter. There are different memory systems in your brain. When people say, I'm losing my memory, they usually mean something fairly specific. The name that won't come, the word that hovers just out of reach, the blank moment where a familiar fact used to live. Psychologists call that verbal working memory and verbal retrieval. And those are the exact systems that estrogen has been quietly supporting for decades. Here's what the research actually shows. Studies out of the study of women's health across the nation, a large-scale, long-running project, found that memory performance does dip during the perimenopausal transition. But here's the critical part. After menopause, when hormone levels stop fluctuating and settle into their post-reproductive baseline, many of those memory measures stabilize or recover. The decline is most pronounced during the fluctuation, not afterward. Repeat that to yourself. The hardest part is the fluctuation, not what comes after. There's also a massive confounding factor that almost nobody accounts for in casual conversation. Sleep disruption, night sweats, the 3 a.m. wake-ups, the racing mind at bedtime. Sleep is the brain's primary consolidation and clearing system. During deep sleep, the glymphatic system, essentially your brain's overnight cleaning crew, flushes metabolic waste products. including those associated with cognitive impairment from neural tissue. If your sleep is fragmented for months or years, your memory will suffer, not because your brain is degenerating, but because the maintenance work isn't getting done. Think about it this way. You have a sharp employee who starts missing their overnight shifts. Work starts piling up. Output gets slower. You wouldn't conclude that employee is permanently impaired. You'd look at what disrupted the shifts. So, what do? Protect sleep with the same seriousness you'd protect a critical business asset. This means addressing night sweats medically if they're happening. This is a treatable symptom, not a sentence. It means evaluating sleep hygiene, not as a wellness trend, but as neurological necessity. And it means talking to your doctor about whether cognitive symptoms are primarily occurring on nights following poor sleep, because that pattern is highly telling. Also worth knowing, cardiovascular exercise has more evidence behind it for maintaining cognitive function in midlife women than almost any supplement or brain training app on the market. Aerobic activity increases BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which functions like fertilizer for neural connections. Not metaphorically, literally. Now this is the part that doesn't show up on any blood work panel, but it might be the most psychologically disruptive element of all. Midlife for women often coincides with a convergence of seismic identity shifts happening simultaneously. Kids leaving home, parents aging or passing, career ceilings or reinventions, long-term relationships hitting critical junctures, physical appearance changing in ways that the culture has very strong, very loud opinions about. And underneath all of it, a quiet but insistent question that won't go away. Who am I now? Outside of everything I have been doing for everyone else? Carl Jung wrote about the concept of individuation, the psychological process of becoming more fully yourself, often catalyzed by midlife. He saw the second half of life as less about external achievement and more about internal integration. The parts of yourself that got shelved in service of building a life. The creative self, the ambitious self, the self that wanted different things. Those parts don't just disappear. They go quiet and wait. And sometimes, somewhere in the 40s, they start knocking. That knocking can feel like dissatisfaction without a clear source. It can feel like restlessness. It can feel like grief for a version of yourself you never fully became. And when it arrives alongside hormonal fluctuation, sleep disruption, and a body that's changing faster than you expected, it can feel like falling apart. Here's what I want you to hear on that. The psychological turbulence of midlife in women is not a sign that something has gone wrong. In many cases, it's a sign that something has gone right, that your sense of self has matured past the structures that were keeping a smaller version of you contained. A woman named Sophia, 46, ran her own interior design firm, built a life she had worked hard for, told me she spent 2 full years thinking she was depressed. Nothing brought her joy anymore. She felt disconnected from her work, her friends, her marriage. She started therapy, expecting to work through some hormonal fog. What she found instead was a woman who had been building someone else's idea of success since she was 22 and had never actually asked herself what she wanted. The hormonal shifts hadn't caused the crisis. They had dissolved the buffer zone between her and it. So, what do you do when the identity piece is in the mix? First, recognize that psychological questioning at midlife is developmentally normal, not a symptom of mental illness, and not evidence that your life has been wrong. It's a phase with a name, individuation. Second, find a therapist or space specifically familiar with midlife transition in women. This is distinct from general depression treatment. The frame matters. Third, resist the cultural pressure to pathologize the questioning and medicate it away before you've actually listened to what it's saying. Let's end where almost no conversation about this topic ends, with what actually happens after. Because the narrative is almost always, women's minds and bodies decline at midlife, and the conversation is about managing loss. But that is an embarrassingly incomplete story. Longitudinal studies on cognitive development in women over 50 show that certain capacities actually strengthen with age: pattern recognition, contextual thinking, the ability to hold complexity without needing it resolved, emotional intelligence, when supported and not suppressed. The research in positive psychology and aging consistently shows that women who navigate the perimenopausal transition with good support, medical, psychological, relational, often describe the decade of their 50s as the one where they came most fully into themselves. There's even a term for it in some psychological literature: postmenopausal zest, which, I'll grant you, is a deeply unglamorous phrase. But the phenomenon it's pointing at is real. The energy that was routed for decades into hormonal cycles, the monthly emotional management, the fertility-related neurological overhead, gets freed up and redirected. Women describe clarity they hadn't felt in years, a directness and confidence in their own perspectives, a much lower tolerance for nonsense, which, in many cases, is a feature, not a bug. Here's what I want you to take from all of this. If you're in your 40s and you're feeling like your mind is betraying you, you're not imagining it, but you are almost certainly misinterpreting it. Your brain is not breaking. It's in the most profound transition it will make outside of adolescence. And like adolescence, it is noisy and disorienting and completely survivable. The women who move through this period with the least damage are the ones who stopped treating their symptoms as shameful secrets and started treating them as information. They got educated. They asked better questions of their doctors. They stopped performing fine when they weren't. They found communities, real ones, not just Instagram accounts, where women were telling the truth about what midlife actually felt like from the inside. The question was never really, are women over 40 losing their minds? The real question is whether we're finally willing to actually understand what their minds are doing and give them the support, the science, and the honest conversation they've deserved all along. Think about where that woman with the keys in the freezer is now. She got her hormones checked. She addressed her sleep. She started moving her body intentionally. She had a long conversation with herself and with a therapist about what she actually wanted her next chapter to look like. 12 months later, the fog had largely lifted. The clarity that arrived in its place was something she hadn't felt since her 20s, except now it had 43 years of hard-earned wisdom sitting right behind it. She didn't lose her mind. She found a bigger one. If this gave you a new lens on something you or someone you love is going through, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're ready to go even deeper on the psychology of women's health, identity, and the neuroscience of midlife transition, you know where to find us.